years.
1972.
Okay.
I was 25 years old.
Okay.
My family was broken. My marriage was broken. My health was broken. I was actually living on the street of Atlanta, Georgia, sleeping in a box. My mind had left me. I'd done so much drugs and alcohol. Going all the way back, I grew up in the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains. My father was a drunkard. My grandfather had a moonshine still. I learned to cut and shoot and do all those things growing up, but never learned about Jesus or God or church or anything.
What's cut and
cut and shoot?
What's cut and shoot? Cut people?
Cut people, cut and shoot.
Oh,
that's
cut.
that's
Cut and
Appalachian
shoot
bro.
people.
Yeah, cut and shoot.
Cut.
Okay.
Cut
and shoot.
people.
Okay.
Okay.
Cut and shoot. Okay.
I like the President Reagan's
Okay.
brother
Wow.
just a little bit better than
I
this.
I told you I was from Tennessee,
Okay.
the
Okay.
mountains of eastern Tennessee.
So that was your upbringing
Get over
in a that was your life.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay,
Very,
now you're
very
in a
true.
box. Wait, you're in a box in Atlanta, sleeping. Your mind is because of alcohol. Did you know you were in such a state, or are you just kind of tripping so far you didn't really even know it?
Probably from the time I was 9 years old, Matt, it started. Someone gave me a baby lamb. I had to walk 2 miles to catch the school bus, and we never had anything. We never had electricity or running water, and had free lunches at school. But someone gave me a baby lamb on the way home one day, and it became very precious to me as a 9-year-old child in an abusive home. And my father beat that lamb to death in front of me, butchered it, killed it. At 9 years old, my heart just became hard. I began to scream, ran off into the mountains, screaming, "He's killed my lamb." But I made a promise that I'd never shed another tear, and anybody that got hurt from there on, it would be someone else. I knew nothing about evil, but at 9 years old, a spirit of rebellion came into my life. And from that point on, I was throwing rocks at police and trying to burn down the schoolhouses and stealing cars. I stole a car and wound up killing some people, and went into reform school and kind of grew up in the reform school and saw people raped and killed and hanged themselves. But my heart just got harder and harder and harder. So by 1972, I was married. I'd been kicked out of school even before I went to the reform school. But I met this little girl. She was 15 years old.
Wow.
And I was about 16 and a half when we got married.
Wow.
And we didn't know. All I knew was hatred and violence. And her father was a bartender in Chicago, but she didn't have the violence that I had. But I brought her into that lifestyle and began robbing and traveling all over the country. Together, robbing stores.
You were like a Bonnie and Clyde kind of thing?
Yeah.
Are you kidding me?
I'm serious.
Look at her.
I'm
She
serious.
couldn't hurt anybody.
Yeah.
Now, Matt and I have done some fun things.
I waited in the car.
Wow.
She
you
was
guys.
the getaway
She was
driver?
a getaway driver. Yeah.
Oh, my God. I've never met a getaway driver.
Raised in
She's a
Arizona.
pretty good driver, you know. So. But she had a good
Wow,
teacher.
you guys.
Her dad hauled moonshine whiskey, so she had a good teacher, you know.
Yeah.
to drive her, so.
Knew how to get out of town, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Wow.
this really you're not
hard
making
line.
any of this
No,
up.
sir.
You're not.
No,
you got
this
a criminal record apparently
Yes.
as long as you're
Wow.
armed.
Yes.
Okay.
Very,
Now,
very
did you
much
know
never
what
caught
drew
me.
you to this kid? What'd she say?
They never caught me. Well, they're watching right now.
so. They are.
There's a police officer standing right there.
I know.
Okay.
Funny thing about it, my son's a police officer. Can you believe that?
Isn't that
Wow.
amazing?
God's got a
Okay.
sense of humor.
He's got a sense of
Okay,
humor.
what in the world happened?
Okay, so take us to your departure from this earth. What happened?
Okay. In the late 60s, in that condition, I was arrested and actually broke out of jail, Fulton County Jail in Atlanta, Georgia.
Wow.
It's documented. And but it's past the statute of limitations.
Thank you,
See,
Jesus.
gray hair now, see?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Gray hair. So,
Wow.
But here's what happened. I called, see, she had to leave with our babies She almost committed suicide. Had Billy Graham not come on television and spoke to her heart through a little black and white TV set and warned about the dangers of hell. Had God not spoke through him to her, she left, took the kids, and went back home. So I just went deeper and deeper. But after breaking out of jail, I called her and said, can I have another chance? I really would like to be a father. I would like to be a husband. And my kids love me. And she said, so we'll try it. And we did try. She tried to help me. She'd lock me up in the bathroom and the bedroom, and I'd break the doors down and climb out the windows. I had to get to the drugs and the alcohol. But in 1972, I went down to the corner market. My little son was with me. He was 5 years old. And I was a violent person, man. I mean, I'm ashamed of it now, but I was full of it. And I walked into that market, and a man was coming out the door. And he shoved the door, and I shoved the door, but that's all it took. I exploded in anger and busted his head, knocked him down on the floor, and people were screaming. My little son saw all this, but that man didn't stay down. He got up with a broken 16-ounce glass bottle and started stabbing me. The very first stab severed the biceps muscle and the arteries and the ligaments in my left arm. And every time my heart would beat, the blood was just pumping out on the floor. In my anger, I'm still trying to hit this guy, and he's cutting me and cutting me. But they said, if you don't get to a hospital, you're going to bleed to death. And they put me in the passenger side of a car and drove me to the nearest hospital. By the time I got there, I was virtually dead. I almost bled to death. Well, they tried to help me and stabilize me and put me in an ambulance to send me to a bigger hospital. And in the back of that ambulance, laying there, 25 years old, with bleeding ulcers and my hair falling out and a nervous wreck and no reputation, a young man looked down into my face, a paramedic, and said, "Sir, do you know Jesus Christ?"
Hello. Wow.
I didn't know Jesus. I didn't know what he was talking about. I was so paranoid. If anything intimidated me, I lashed out at it. Wow. It made me angry and worse. So I started cussing him and his Jesus. I cursed. That's all I knew. That's all I knew. And he kept saying, Jesus loves you. If you'll call on him, he'll help you. And as he was speaking to me about this, the ambulance, I thought, blew up. I mean, it caught on fire, and the thing filled full of smoke, and I thought it was an electrical fire. So I'm laying here near death, and the thing is so full of smoke, I can't breathe. She's in the ambulance with me. And worse than that, my body felt like it began to just come up off the gurney and float away. And I began to hear people screaming and crying and groaning, and I didn't know what that was. And then when I began to see out of this thick smoke that was choking me, I'm looking into what looked like the open mouth of a volcanic crater, a burning crater. And I'm falling into this thing with no help. And worse than that, I begin to see people in this fire. And they're screaming and crying, and they're burning, but they're not burning up. Wow. Now I've been shot and cut and had things done to me that I won't even talk about here. Got high on pain, got to a point in my life that I hated everything and everybody. But this did something to me. I didn't know what it was. And when I looked into the face of men that I saw shot to death in liquor store robberies, and I saw people that died of drug overdoses and died drunk in automobile accidents, and they're screaming at me and calling my name and telling me to go back, to not come there. There's no escape. There's no way out. And I'm just falling into this, and I don't understand what it is, but I can't breathe, and the stench is awful, and the depression is awful.
What is your life? It is a vapor. The Bible says your life is like a puff of steam. It's here for a moment, and then it's gone.
My name's Kevin. I grew up in Manchester, in England, in the 70s, into a background. In those days, you was either considered a Roman Catholic or like us, we was considered an Anglican, which is Church of England. Now, we never went to church. All that means is I was christened as a child. Infant baptism is a big ritual there. It's a big superstition. People believe that you can't get into heaven without some sort of infant ritual. And so the only times in my childhood I set foot in a church was at one of these christenings or was at somebody's wedding. And then when I got to secondary school or high school, I just professed to be an atheist back in those days. But really, even though I didn't know much about the Bible back then, and I didn't know much about Jesus Christ, I did really know one thing. I knew deep down it was all true. Even in the days when I professed to be an atheist, there was just something inside of me, a nagging thought, my conscience, which just told me it was all true. And so as time went on, I left school and I just became a big sinner. I drank up as much sin as I could in various ways, and I did things which are real shameful to speak about in that time. And so time went on and I just became a worse and worse sinner. And I got to my mid-20s and I started asking those questions that everybody asks at some point in life. Why are we here? And what happens when this life is over? And I would philosophize. I remember each day I would just philosophize more and more. And I'd come up with the most silliest interpretations of things. And this would keep on going. But I knew there was a God at this time. I just looked at the whole creation, the Bible says, declares his handiwork, and my conscience, again, just keeps telling me this is true. And at first I would look at other religions. I wanted to become anything but a Christian. And I remember I looked at things like Buddhism, but it was just all fairy tale stuff. I just could not, it was just nonsense, really. And then eventually I started to open the Bible and look at it as like a history book. It was an old Bible that was passed down the family from my granddad. And I just started in Genesis verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I just kept on reading and it seemed to make sense. And now I didn't really understand it at that time, and I was trying to interpret it through my atheistic worldview. I still had, even though I wasn't an atheist, I still had a naturalistic worldview. I remember reading about the manna in the desert. I was thinking, well, that must be snow. These people must not really understand, these primitive people. But I still knew it was all true. And about the same time, I started to go to a high Anglican church, which is basically, it's like Catholicism but without the Pope. It's all prayer book rituals. The sermons there are only 10 to 15 minutes, and there wasn't really the gospel preached there, the message of how to get saved. And what truth I did hear there was all surrounded in hypocrisy. It was all filtered through that. Now, I was doing things in that time. I just became more and more religious. I thought I was a Christian for about 6 years. I went to that church, but I never knew Jesus Christ. I never really knew him. But there was so much hypocrisy going on. I mean, for instance, me myself, you would have thought for an hour and a half on a Sunday, I was deeply religious. But for the rest of the week, I just lived like a complete hypocrite. You know, I'd go to nightclubs and things and do shameful things, and then I'd be in church on a Sunday. Now, I knew that was wrong, but I'd look at other people in the church and they'd be getting blind drunk as well on a Saturday night. And I just think, well, they've been Christians longer than me. And so this time just went on and on like this. And eventually, I always knew that there was something more to Christianity I didn't have. Now, of course, it was Jesus Christ, because in this time, God was just always a distant deity to me. He was just, I didn't really know him. I mean, I had a cliche, you know, I'd say, I've got a relationship with Jesus. Christianity is a relationship with Jesus, but I didn't really know him. And so I started to listen to sermons and messages and look at teachings outside of the church I was in. And I was going through a series on the Sermon on the Mount, and then one day I was sat in the garden listening to a sermon, And I heard the words of Jesus from Matthew 5:27-30, where Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say unto you, if you look at a woman to lust after her, you've already committed adultery with her in your heart." And Jesus went on to say there, cast your eye out, because it is better to enter heaven with one eye than to enter hell with both. And now the context there is, of course, adultery. It's not saying it's a sin for a man to have sexual desire for his wife and vice versa, but Jesus does clearly say in those verses that to lust over someone you're not married to is a sin that will surely take you to hell if it's not repented of. Now, I had heard those verses many times before.